Welcome to Accommodations, Modifications, and Scaffolding, Planning for Instruction, presented by Fairfax County Public Schools, Office of Special Education Instruction. My name is Gina North. I'm a curriculum and resource teacher for Region 2.
And I'm Wendy Bohm. I'm also a curriculum resource teacher in Region 2.
Here are our learning outcomes for today. We're going to understand the difference between an accommodation and modification. Using examples, we will identify accommodations versus modifications. And we will also explore how to scaffold lessons. Let's start with looking at the difference between accommodations and modifications. What do you notice about this graphic? The accommodation has provided a way for each student to be at the same visual level. The modification has cleared the obstacles that limit each student's view. An accommodation changes how a student learns the material. Accommodations can help kids learn the same material as their peers. This allows them to meet the same expectations. A student with dyslexia, for example, might listen to an audio version of a book, but it's still the same book that the rest of the class is reading. Likewise, a student who has trouble focusing might get seated next to the teacher, but still has to do all the regular class assignments. Accommodations for testing can be different from those used for teaching. For example, using spell check might help a student with writing difficulties take notes during class. However, it wouldn't be appropriate during a weekly spelling test. At the same time, this student might benefit from having extra time to complete the spelling test or using a keyboard if the physical act of writing is difficult. So then what is a modification? A modification changes what a student is taught or expected to learn. So kids who are far behind their peers may need changes to the curriculum they're learning. This is what we refer to as a modification. For example, a student could be assigned shorter or easier reading assignments or homework that's different from the rest of the class. Kids who receive modifications are not expected to learn the same material as their classmates. Modifications in testing often mean that a student covers less material or material that is less complex. For example, a spelling test may require the class to study 20 words. However, a student with modifications might only have to study 10 of those. Or there might be 2 different lists of spelling words. With a modification, what the student is testing on is different. Take a look at this cartoon. Differentiating the access points and meeting each child's needs can be challenging, but we have to try to overcome these barriers. With so much already on our plates as special education teachers, it's often easier to create a lesson or assessment that everyone will take. This slide is a reminder why this method, although less time-consuming, doesn't benefit students. When planning, consider student strengths, needs, and those potential additional barriers to instruction. This will allow all students a fairer opportunity to access the general education curriculum. We are now going to look at several curriculum expectations and look more closely at an accommodation and modification for each. Our first example reads, provided the world history text, students will read the chapter on ancient Greece and complete the graphic organizer describing the social and religious structure of ancient Greece. Let's now look at the expectations in columns 1 and 2. Column 1 says, using a website which reduces the reading level of the textbook, the student will read the chapter on ancient Greece and complete the graphic organizer describing the social and religious structure of ancient Greece. Column 2 says, after reading a book at their independent reading level, the student will match the names of common gods and goddesses, Zeus, Hera, Apollo, and Athena. Which one is the accommodation and which one is the modification? If we go back to the definition of each, we will notice that how the student learns the material is different in column 1. Here the student is using a text at a reading level lower than that of the world history text and at their own independent reading level. But the task is still the same. The student is still expected to complete the graphic organizer and describe the social and religious culture of ancient Greece. This is an accommodation. In column 2, we have a modification. The what the student is expected to do is different from the grade level expectation. Here, the student will also read about ancient Greece using a text at their reading level. However, this time, the student is expected to match names of gods and goddesses. The task itself has been modified. Let's look at another example. When given 10 problems, students will determine the slope of a line when given an equation of the line, the graph of the line, or 2 points on the line. Let's look at which is an accommodation and which is a modification. In column 1, the student will draw a line on the graph when given the coordinates of 2 points of the line on 5 problems. In column 2, the student will determine the slope of a line when given an equation of the line, the graph of the line, or 2 points on the line on the even-numbered problems. For this example, column number 1 is providing the student with a modification. The task is different here, where we are asking the student to draw a line when given 2 coordinates. The student in this case is not expected to determine the slope of a line when given an equation. The student is still learning about graphs, but at a different level. Column 2 shows us an accommodation for this standard. Here, the student is still going to be given an equation and is expected to graph the slope of the line, but they will be doing so for 5 problems instead of 10. The what the student is expected to do is the same, but how they will demonstrate this knowledge is different. Here is a third example. Students will write an essay to explain similarities and differences of techniques and literary forms represented in the literature of different cultures and eras, specifically haikus, sonnets, fables, and myths. Let's look at the 2 options for this example. Column 1 provides the student with 2 writing samples and asks the student to identify which is a fable and which is a haiku. In column 2, the student is expected to explain the similarities and differences and techniques of literary forms, but the student is using a graphic organizer rather than writing an essay. Which is the accommodation and which is the modification? The expectation for column 2 has not changed from the curriculum standard. The student is still expected to describe the similarities and differences. The what has not changed, but the how, writing an essay, has changed. The student is using a graphic organizer instead. So this is an accommodation. In column 1, the expectation has changed from explaining to identifying. Column 1 represents the modification. In this example, the curriculum expectation is, in an essay, students will describe the processes of photosynthesis and respiration, including the capture, storage, transformation, and flow of energy. In column 1, we notice that the student will be answering multiple choice questions instead of writing an essay. But has the expectation changed? No. The student is still expected to demonstrate knowledge of photosynthesis and respiration, including the capture, storage, transformation, and flow of energy. In column 2, the student expectation has changed. Column 2 is a modification. The student in this case will identify using pictures whether or not photosynthesis is represented. So column 1 is the modification and column 2 is the modification. Let's look at one last example. Here, students will write a multi-paragraph essay that will describe the structure and powers of the local government. That is our curriculum expectation. In which of these is that expectation different? In column 1, the student will label pictures. We have modified what the student is expected to learn. In column 2, the student is still expected to discuss the structure and powers of local government. The difference between what we see in column 2 and the curriculum expectation is that the student will demonstrate this knowledge in a paragraph or a bulleted list rather than an essay, making this an accommodation. When planning for instruction, it's important to consider all levels of this pyramid that you see before you and what accommodations and modifications may be necessary for teaching standards to your students. When planning scaffolds, we are looking at what most students will do. So now let's talk about scaffolding lessons. Scaffold just means we are taking the lesson and chunking it into smaller pieces and providing student supports in order to ensure they learn the concepts. Scaffolding is not the same as differentiating the lesson. Edutopia describes the difference in this way. Scaffolding is breaking up the learning into chunks and providing a tool or structure with each chunk. When scaffolding reading, for example, you might preview the text and discuss key vocabulary, or chunk the text and then read and discuss as you go. With differentiation, you might give a child an entirely different piece of text to read, or shorten the text, or alter it, or modify the writing assignment that follows. Simply put, scaffolding is what you do first with kids. For those students who are still struggling, you may need to differentiate by modifying an assignment or making accommodations, like choosing a more accessible text or assigning an alternative project. We are going to use this writing SOL standard for our example. The standard says that students will use complete and varied sentences when editing their own writing. But what happens when you have a third grade student who has not yet mastered what makes a sentence complete? What will you do to teach this third grade standard and have the student be able to edit their own writing for correct grammar, capitalization, punctuation, and spelling, and specifically use complete and varied sentences? To scaffold a lesson for this standard, we may start by teaching what makes up a sentence. We use a graphic organizer or some other visual tool, such as the one here, to help illustrate our point. You will notice that the first 2 entries here are complete examples. The next 2 remove some of the supports, providing a gradual release to eventually having the student create simple sentences independently. The use of color also helps accentuate the concepts of starting sentences with a capital letter and ending with punctuation. This example demonstrates an I do, we do, you do method. The first 2 examples are done for the student and modeled or explained by the teacher. The next 2 examples have part filled in and can be used in a we do step. The teacher helps the student come up with the parts for the missing blanks. The next step in this process would be a you do, where the student would have no parts filled out and develop simple sentences on their own. This example could be the next step in your scaffolded lesson. Here we are adding another part to our sentence. In the first example on the previous slide, we only had a subject and a verb, or a who or what and an action. Here we are adding more details to our sentence. We again have 2 completed examples that the teacher can use and work through with the student. We have kept the color to highlight the need for a capital letter at the beginning of the sentence and a period at the end. And the student has lots of opportunities to practice this skill independently. Now that you have taught the parts of a sentence and how to write a simple sentence, you would move on to looking at the difference between sentences and fragments. The steps listed here are the scaffolded steps to working the student up to editing their own writing and using complete sentences. So you would start by identifying and correcting fragments, moving on to having the students distinguish between a sentence and a fragment in a list, then have them correct fragments and provide capitalization and punctuation. Then expand it from lists to texts, having the students find and correct fragments within larger pieces. And then they would find and correct fragments in their own writing.
Okay, now we're going to talk about how to scaffold a lesson in math. And we're going to use this model to help us as we break down the lessons. If you'll notice the bottom of the model, the first thing we're doing is breaking the problem into steps. The second step is to use visuals to support understanding, which is our guide. Third, we could use graphic organizers independently at small groups or with teacher support, and this would be our gradual release. Finally, using color coding or guiding questions, we can make the activity mostly independent. But before we do this, we need to remember there are other considerations to think about when programming for math. Certainly the student's processing deficits, IEP accommodations such as the calculator, and other things that you would put into place. But for this presentation, we're only going to talk about strategies to scaffold the lesson. So scaffolding for math provides the students who have learning difficulties a teacher-supported transition, primarily seeing and hearing the teacher demonstrate and model a particular math concept, gradually releasing till the student is able to perform it independently. So for this example, we're going to use Standards of Learning 7.2. The student will solve practical problems involving operations with rational numbers. For this example, we're going to move from a lower level compatible standard, 4.6, and gradually build to the 7th grade standard, all the time working on increasing the student's understanding as well as building independence. First, we're going to talk about breaking the problem into steps. We're going to model. If we look at this problem, it's word problem 4.6. Pedro bought a slice of pizza for $2.50 and a drink for $1.25. How much money did he spend? What operation would we use to solve the problem? We would use addition. The second part of the problem says, how much change would Pedro get if he paid with $5? Again, what operation would we use to solve the problem, and where would I get this information? $5 minus $3.75, which we solved in the first part of the problem, would give us the answer. What we have done here is we have taken a multi-step problem and we've broken it into 2 single pieces and modeled those for the student. We can then combine the 2 statements to create a multi-step word problem. Pedro bought a slice of pizza for $2.50 and a drink for $1.25. How much money did he spend? How much change would he get if he paid with $5? Reminding the students that if you break it into 2 separate steps, it's much easier to solve. Next, we're going to talk about using visual supports to guide understanding, which is the next step up the ladder. For this lesson, we're going to use word problem 5.6. Haley is going to help her uncles paint one of the large activity rooms in a local community center. Someone donated 1 2/3 gallons of paint, and someone else donated 2 3/4 gallons of the same color paint. How much paint will they have to start painting? If it takes 3 3/4 gallons to paint the activity room, how much paint will be left? Since the students have already know how to break the problem into the incremental steps, what we're going to do now is we're going to give the students some guides to help them with the problem. For this, we're going to use word wall cards. This is an example of a word wall card that is available from the Virginia Department of Education just-in-time quick checks. This is an example of least common multiple. In order to solve the word problem, the students will need to know how to make a least common multiple or least common denominator. They will also need to know how to add and subtract fractions that are mixed numbers with unlike denominators. Finally, they're going to need to know how to multiply fractions. Using the just-in-time quick check cards, this is a reminder for the students of how to do the specific steps. These are two other cards that are available, and the first one shows us one method of knowing how to add and subtract numbers with unlike denominators, and the second tells us about multiplying fractions and reminds us with visual models. The third piece of scaffolding a lesson in math is gradual release. And for this, we're going to use graphic organizers independently in small groups or with teacher support to get the students to this level. If we look at this problem, we are now doing SOL Standard 7.2, which is where we wanted to be by the end of this lesson. If you look at the problem, it says that today's high temperature in Chicago was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The low temperature was 15.1 degrees Fahrenheit, lower than yesterday. Yesterday's low temperature was 3 degrees Fahrenheit. What is the difference between the two low temperatures? Using gradual release and completing a word problem on grade level, we can assist the students' understanding of this problem, and we can scaffold it using a graphic organizer. With the graphic organizer, the students can work individually, they can work in small groups, collaboratively, or they can work with a teacher to complete the process, depending on where they are. When we look at this graphic organizer, the students will again break down the problem, but this time they're doing it independently. What is the main idea? In other words, what is the problem asking us? What is the essential information that's given in the problem? Can we make a plan? We need to show our work, and then we're going to write the answer. Working together is a great way for the students to attack this problem, but there are those students that are ready to work more independently, and this is appropriate for them as well. Finally, we're going to use the last level, which is the independent level. And for this level, we can use color-coded and guided questions to help our students achieve mastery mostly independently. For this, we're going to use another 7.2 SOL example. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez are traveling to Richmond, Virginia with their children to see a play. They purchased train tickets, $8 for children, and children under 7 are half price. The tickets for the play are $14 for adults and $6 for each child. Mr. and Mrs. Martinez have 3 children. Ricky and Ramona are 12, and Thomas is 6. How much did the Martinez family pay for the train ride and the plane tickets? Using guiding questions and color-coding the problem, the students are able to highlight the information needed to answer each question. So we're going to go forward, and then we'll come back to this slide. So let's go forward. So what is the question asking you to find? What is the strategy you use to solve the problem? How much will it cost the Martinez family to travel to and from the play? How much will the tickets cost for the entire Martinez family? And what was the total spent by the Martinez family for travel and tickets? If we were able to go back to the question, we could see that we were able to highlight the different pieces that we are solving. So if we look at important information for the train tickets, we need to know how much the train tickets were for adults, how much the train tickets were for the kids. We also need to know the kids' ages because we know that under 7 is half price. By color coding and underlining and breaking apart the problem, the students are then able to solve the problem independently. In closing, today we talked about what is an accommodation and what is a modification. We remember that a modification is a changing in what the student is expected to learn and what is taught. However, what we spent most of the time talking about today were accommodations, and that just changes how the student learns the material. And a great way to teach accommodations and incorporate accommodations is through scaffolding. And remember, scaffolding, the purpose of it is to provide students who have learning difficulties teacher-supported transition from primarily seeing and hearing their teacher demonstrate and model a particular concept to performing it independently. Thank you for your interest in our presentation today. If you have any questions or comments or further concerns, you can email either one of us and we'll be happy to get back to you. Have a great day.
Thank you.